Hello, everyone. I'd like to continue a discussion I started some videos ago about what is Latin. And in that video, I asked questions about, well, what is the Latin language? How is it defined? What is the border in between the Romance languages and what we consider to be, quote-unquote, Latin? And in this video, I want to bring up the subject of vocabulary and word choice. Latin, as you may already know, having seen my other channel, Scorpio Martianus, and having seen some other discussions I've had here, is in fact a language which is spoken today by many thousands of people. So since we use this language every day with each other, we encounter certain issues, as any L2, second language acquisition, as any L2 speakers would encounter. The problems, though, for us who speak Latin in the 21st century are definitely different than those of a regular L2 speaker of, say, Italian, German, Japanese, whatever language. And in the previous video, I asked, what is Latin? Is Latin entirely or mostly limited to the golden age literature of the 1st century BC? And some very strict academes might say that, yes, it's only Ciceronian, Caesarian, Virgil, and anything that's after the Golden Age is lesser Latinity. And whether or not that's true is a matter of style and of discussion, which I would love to continue to have with all of you, especially the doctores among you, who, and by which I mean those of you who know much more about Latin than I do, especially its literature, history, and how to write and speak in the language effectively and with great Latinity. That's something I'm still learning. And so I come across these questions. And the problem, though, is we who speak Latin on a daily basis, we cannot and do not limit ourselves completely to the vocabulary that we find in a regular classical Latin dictionary. We take advantage of the neologisms which have been invented in the centuries that have come after, particularly a great number in the Renaissance, during the Enlightenment, in the 20th century, and even the 21st century. Well, how do we get access to those? Well, there's a lot of material out there. I'm going to talk about those in a second. Since Latin as an entity for us, it's not limited to the 1st century BC, although we all generally seem to agree that mostly it is, except for those medievalists among you. You may particularly like the Latin literature of the medieval period, and why not? It's rich, it's very, very interesting. But Latin of all periods seems to go back again and again to classical Latin as a kind of template, a standard, with great frequency. Well, as I got started speaking Latin, this book, which it may be known to you, wow, second edition, that's an old one, and it's sturdy since I've had it for many, many years, since 2005, written by the late John Troutman, is one example. And this book has many dialogues. I've recorded all the dialogues on this YouTube channel a couple years ago, so you can listen to them. For example, Quid Interpernis facitis, obsonamus, pater mi munus cum saepemit. So we shop. My father often buys me a little gift. Great dialogues. Some have criticized the Latinity of this author. What is Latinity? Latīnitās is the good Latin style. Cicero was particularly strict that Roman citizens should not merely speak Latin, but to speak the best Latin. And that may be a standard we should also strive towards. I think it's fairly reasonable since we are Quirites. In my Quirites video on the Scorpio Martianus channel, I talk about Latin and ancient Greek speakers who live today. We can use the name for ourselves, Quirites, which is a name used in the post-Roman era to mean Latin speakers. And I, by extension, say also ancient Greek speakers. We crazy, hyper-classical people. So Troutman has sometimes questionable Latinity. Most of his stuff is quite good, though, and is quite well known, maybe well known to you as well. Now, I more recently, about a year ago, came upon Stephen Berard's Vita Nostra Subsidiat Colloquia Latina, and in some ways it's superior and inferior to the Troutman book. It doesn't have the same quantity of good dialogues. It's more of a classroom exercise type book, but it has to me its greatest utility has been the study of the locutiones. For example, rationem ducere, rationem habere, to have regard for, to be concerned about. Idioms that we could read in a letter of Cicero and not necessarily understand them inherently. So supremely useful that, but also extremely useful and on par with the Troutman lexicon is that we have an enormous quantity of the words that are neologisms. For example, words like, for jobs, clavicularius, a locksmith, electridis artifex, an electrician, ferrarius, hardware dealer. Some of these are ancient, or some of them are more modern, like hamaxurgus, for an automaker. I like a lot of these, and a lot of these are quite good. Some of them I also question, though, like, is this really the best Latinity? But I think it's, on the whole, my personal opinion, a little bit better than Troutman. But there are things in there which Troutman covers, which Berard does not. And another one I got very recently, which I love, Anna Andresian's Vocabula Picta, pardon Renault, a little close to the camera. And here's what the cover looks like. Illustrated Latin Lexicon for the Modern World. Let's take a look at a picture and see some of these beautiful and useful words, like different kinds of foods, for example. Like a libum, a cake, liba cunculus, for a muffin or a cupcake, perhaps. Looks like a muffin to me. Baniculus cinnamonius, a cinnamon bun, and so forth. So a corustum for pie, corustulum for cookies. These are great. These are really wonderful. This is one of my favorites because of the pictures. I'm very fond of the pictures. And also the Latinity. And Andresian has enormously high Latinity. That is the choice of words. Like, what would be low Latinity? That's a good question. Words that would be taken directly from a Romance language, perhaps, or maybe even directly from English, assuming that they're Latin. And in fact, they might not be. For example, we saw the word electridis a second ago, which is the nominative form, which I'll write here, is electris, Greek word for amber. So amber, by metaphor and association, means electricity, because when you rub amber, it causes static electricity, and therefore that's where the origin of the word is from. But if we were to use electricity, we might think that electricitas would be an appropriate Latin term. And I don't believe it has been accepted in any Latin authors in particular, but I haven't done too much research. So that's the kind of thing where this would be a high Latinity word, and something like electricitas may not be. Actually, I think this is an eta in Greek, so that would be electris, if I'm not mistaken. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Okay, well that's the situation where we have some great sources, and though some say, oh, but this very famous one, for example, good, but not the best Latinity. Or others say Springhetti, Emilio Springhetti, who wrote this wonderful book, Institutione Stili Latini, written entirely in Latin. I've annotated it heavily, as you see, with these. He criticizes all the Italianisms. He lived in the middle of the 20th century, and he was a Latinist at the Vatican, and he criticizes all kinds of things which are not appropriate words to use in the... here's a good one. Oops, pardon that shaking there. Audire bene, or audire male. So audire bene or male, it's bonam minus bonam malam existimatione habere, and then the non-classical meaning, pro auditu non valere, aequor esse auditu. So what does all that mean? So audire bene does not mean to hear well, as it would literally seem to be in the literal translation. It means to have a good reputation. Ille bene audit. He has a good reputation. Ille male audit. He has a bad reputation. Whereas the classical meaning is, that's the classical meaning. The non-classical meaning would be based on our modern languages, like Italian or English, and it would be literally not to hear well. And there's other ways to express that in Latin instead, which are actually given here, which is the auditu non valere, not to be strong of hearing. Acri esse oops, where is it? Yeah, acri esse auditu, to have bad hearing, or to have good hearing, depending on the term we want to use. So auditu valere, to have good hearing. So that's another way to try to get at it. That book, however, is written entirely in Latin. So unless you're a Latin speaker, you can't go, or Latin reader, very fluent Latin reader, you can't just go to it and enodare and untie all of its connections very easily. So that's all the preamble. Now I want to get to the point. Or the anecdote, perhaps. With one of my dearest colleagues, we were having dinner at a Greek restaurant, and then we were outside and we noticed, there's a lemon tree above us. And we speak in Latin together all the time. So she asked me, well, what is a lemon in Latin? And of course, we went to a fantastic source, and this is perhaps of these four, this is kind of like the source of all of them. Let me just make a little visual break here. And that would be the Neo-Latin Lexicon, I'll move this over in a second, .org. And it's called the Lexicon Morganianum or Morganianum Owens, because Patrick Owens is the person who continues to maintain this wonderful and extremely important and useful website to us. This is the copia of everything, because it has in it pretty much every single neologism for anything you could find. I've pushed it to its limits and searched for things that it doesn't have yet, but it may in the future. And Patrick Owens is continuously looking for ways to update it. So it's an invaluable resource to us because these are curated. Well, Springhetti tells you his opinion. These, though, have lists of vocabulary with, and they say, this is the term for this, and that is the term for that. They give you a one-to-one word correlation and sometimes a few synonyms. Whereas the Neo-Latin lexicon, well, what if you look up a lemon? Well, if you look up a lemon, you see a very lengthy discussion of a paragraph with all sorts of different authors having made mention of, well, there's, they'd say, well, there's the Citreum, there's the Citrium malum, the citrus apple, and there's also the mention of a limo, or even limonium. Well, this is kind of neumutum. This is not really a surprise to us if we are familiar with some of the European languages, because the word for lemon in English, lemon, obviously, in Spanish, limon, and it's limone in Italian, but it's citron in French, citrone in German, and I think citron, if I'm not mistaken, in Dutch, but I'll have to check. And so why is that? Well, there is an ancient tree and fruit, which is its scientific name, I believe, is the Citrus medicus. And it was, because of its antiseptic properties, as citrus tends to have, was used for medicinal purposes as a kind of disinfectant, I suppose, as a lemon is still used today. But the limo, I don't know anything about that ancient plant or if it's still used anywhere. But obviously today, the lemon, the true lemon, as we use it for food, is everywhere in all kinds of places all around the world. So we're very familiar with that plant. So what's the right word for it? It was associated with the Citrus medicus, the scientific term, when it came into Europe from the Arab world in the 12th century. So when it came in the 12th century, the Arabic word was related, is what this limo is from, and then they were associating it with an ancient word. Both of these are perfectly acceptable ways to bring in a neologism, according to, again, Springhetti, who quotes Horace, and he quotes Cicero and others, who they say, yeah, you use the Latin word for the thing that's from the classical period, or if you're Cicero himself, obviously he's using his own Ciceronian Latin to the greatest extent possible. For example, J.N. Adams, in an article about Romanitas, which I read recently, and I'll put the link in the description, he discusses the fact that you can actually, that Cicero would call philosophers vidi docti, or something like that, or sapientes, when he was being neutral or favorable to them, but philosopi, philosophers, when he wanted to disparage them. So that's an interesting usage. And that comes back to the question of, what is our Latin? Is it this thing from the 1st century BC, because if we have a certain community of people, well, they have a sense of humor, they have a style. Cicero, for example, if we're imitating him, then we know that if we're using something that's archaic or foreign, then it's going to have a certain tinge. And if we don't agree on, because, for example, when I'm a speaker of different European and, well, also Japanese, I speak other languages, so I pick up on the subtleties and humor and disparaging qualities of certain words of the target language, because I'm adopting the sensibilities of the native speakers. Right, and so that's a big deal when we're going not just to one location, say Rome, but also a specific time. What do we choose? Anyway, so that's how these questions work, and it's very difficult, because if I make a joke in Latin and I'm using a sense of humor which would make sense, like if I call someone a filosopus, to my English ear, to my Italian ear, it doesn't sound offensive. But to Cicero, it would. And to his audience, it also would. So that's an issue, I suppose, when that comes to ancient words, too. But as far as the total novata verba neologisms, citerium malum or limo, so which one do we use? Now, the citation there in the Morganianum, in the Neo-Latin lexicon, it just says that, well, in the 12th century, it was associated with the one, so citerium malum or limo, if you want to use for people who want to use the more Arabic word. Obviously, both were in currency among Latin speakers in Europe because the different modern languages picked up on that. And some say citron, others say limone. Now, I think this is a significant issue for us because we now have to decide with a plethora of synonyms. Kind of, are they really synonyms? I guess these certainly would be. But I see and I was just discussing this with Jesse Kraft in our podcast Legio XIII, which you should go subscribe to the YouTube channel and have a listen if you want to listen to a Latin language discussion in Latin, of course, about this exact topic. And we both agree that we're comfortable. And the colleague with whom I was having dinner, where we started having this discussion, we both agree that learning these different synonyms is not only desirable, but indeed necessary if we want to read the autores, the authors of the Renaissance, Middle Ages, and any period. Now, this isn't necessarily that big of a problem for those of us who are regularly speaking Latin. But if we are just starting, we want to learn the vox propria, as we might call it, the vox propria, the proper voice or the proper terminology for a certain term. The exact meaning. What is a cup? Well, that's a poculum. That's easy enough. It's an ancient word. And there are synonyms for that. But what's the sun? Sol. What's the sky? Caelum. There are words that, at least in spelling, if not in pronunciation, are precisely known to us for certain things, for anything that was in the ancient world. But there's so many things where we know what this word is in Italian, or German, or Japanese, or Russian, and we have not just one choice. So therefore, for teachers, I think this is a huge burden for those who are using an active method in the classroom. As I mentioned, we have the thousands of Latin speakers in the world. A great number are middle school, high school teachers, as well as academic people in universities, professors, and a huge number of enthusiasts like myself. So I see this as an issue because I like to, and I don't think it's wrong to do, as I've done in many other languages, to associate one word with another word. And you can't do that with every term, especially abstract ideas and things that are relating to humor and culture. Those usually can even be untranslatable completely, depending on the language. But something as simple as a lemon? Well, what is it? What's the first word? So we have a burden, I think, as teachers of Latin. We have to either choose one. My colleague that night, she said that when confronted with these issues, and these issues are just multiplex, because what is the word for France, for example? Is it Gallia or is it Francia? And these are two choices that I would prefer. There's also Franco-Gallia and Gallo-Francia, which are used by different authors, but those are rarer in the corpus of literature. Gallia, most frequent, Francia, a close second, certainly after the Franks have invaded in the, what century was that, 700s? And they come into or maybe earlier, but they come into the area of what's now France, of ancient Gaul. So in English, we distinguish France from Gaul, but Gallia and Francia are complete synonyms as far as we can understand in Latin for all ages. So I think that's an issue too. I know the name of France. I know La Francia. I know in modern Greek though it's Igalia. I think if I spell it right, I hope I am spelling this in the modern Greek fashion correctly. And therefore, in modern form of ancient Greek, koine or whatever, we could say he Gallia or something. Oh, and that should be a capital gamma, but whatever. So for that reason, I prefer Gallia because it's the same in this modern language, a very conservative modern language being modern Greek. And then if we speak of the French language, it's a Gallica or Francica. I think this imposes a burden on us as speakers of this language because then we have to be able to interpret many things. It's not bad, but it's an onus that's on our shoulders. It's a difficulty. It is more challenging. If I want to know the word for France in Greek, in modern Greek, it's Igalia. I don't have to choose. I know it's not going to be more than one word, or more than one word for a lemon, or whatever. So this is the problem. And I think the only thing I am certain about is that it is difficult. It's difficult for teachers to choose words when they have access to the neolatinlexicon.org or other books, and they're trying to find the best word. Well, what does the best mean? Why is it best? Best because it would make sense to a Roman? Well, Romans wouldn't understand a lot of our concepts, so it doesn't really matter, perhaps. So that would be one way to answer that. Or is it the best word because it concords best with the Latinity of the 1st century BC? And so I agree very much with my dear colleague's response that, yeah, we should learn as many of these synonyms as we need to get into the literature of whatever century that interests us, certainly. And and that's great. But when I'm at home, do I call it a limo or a citrium malum? When I am in discussions with people about cum ego in Gallia essem or cum ego in Francia essem? When I was in France, which one do I use? Do I choose one or the other spontaneously based on my mood? That's not very common, not for something like a whole country, to have that kind of synonym in a modern language. So that makes Latin definitely something not like other modern languages, where there is an academia, like in the Della Crusca in Italy, the academy in Madrid, the academy that's in Paris, for example, where there's standardization of the language. We don't have that in English, but we have newspapers and other news organizations like the BBC in England. We have quite a few newspapers in America which have standardized our terminology as well. So at Webster's Dictionary, we have come to our own ways of standardizing them. As our community grows, as the number of Latin speakers increases, as it does every year, what words will we choose? And then there's a significant problem because, especially with this one, if we just all agree that Gallia is the better word for France, with analogy to modern Greek, for France in all periods, even though it could be ancient Gaul, it could be modern France. Gallia is the only word if we say that. Well, that's great. Oh, but then we cut off all of the other authors, which are far more numerous, by the way, and far more rich in the amount of works that they've written in the Renaissance alone than it was in antiquity. It's only something like 2% of Latin literature is the classical literature. The enormous majority of it is all from post-classical, late Latin, medieval Latin, Renaissance Latin, and Neo-Latin. So if we say, okay, Gallia is going to be the vox propria, okay, but now we cut off Francia, or even Franco-Gallia, and all those other terms. I'm not very fond of Franco-Gallia. It seems like a compromise. It seems like, oh, I can't choose. Well, the Greeks chose. But the Greeks never had the problem because they never introduced an alternative Francia or at least not to a significant degree. Our literature is predominantly prior to us. Modern languages primarily live in the present, I think, and they go back to the past less than we do. That's our power as Latin speakers, Latin authors, Latin readers. We can appreciate terminology going back, and we can expand it richly with all kinds of synonyms. But the onus on us is much greater. And I think this, more than anything else, is what distinguishes Latin from the other modern languages. And I think it's something which requires some resolution. On the individual idiolect basis, it requires resolution. Now I have to choose, or spontaneously. I cannot literally say Citrum malum, Citrio malum, and limo at the same time. I can't say Gallian Francia, or the alternatives, the Gallo. I can also bring in the other two, Gallo Franci or Franco Gallia, at the same time. I have to spontaneously choose one of those according to a personal preference informed by things like this, or the fact that it's actually France and Francia and all these other European languages. What do I do? And these are only two problems of thousands and thousands of them, which we encounter on a daily basis and which we're going to continue to encounter. So the problem is, I think, evident. The question then, for those of us who use Latin on a daily basis, and oh my God, the poor people who speak Greek today, do they use Koine words? Do they use Attic words? Do they use Byzantine words? They have even less of at least we have this 1st century BC as some kind of clear center. And no doubt that Cicero and the Romans, who esteemed Greek, were always talking about the Attic Greek being the best and the one to be imitated and studied in Athens. But even that Greek at that point was a form of Koine. So what do we do? What do we do about this? So how would you resolve this problem? I'd love it if you, thank you for listening this far. Please leave a comment in the comment section of this video. Ask people wherever I post this on Facebook or Twitter if you want to leave a comment, or on Reddit as well. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, because I am at a loss. I've discussed this with other colleagues like Logan Kilpele and Anaius, who you have to check out his channel too, James Haney's channel. It's really good poetry there. And I am not sure which way to go or how we can resolve this beyond where it currently is. I would love to hear from all of you. Thanks so much for watching, and valete. Take care.
Retinentia quantu lacesat, inebentibus pectoribus, modo dogmata nostra capesat. Logos est ubi mirificus, licet hos oculos libitis.